Bona tarda a tothom. Em dic Carlos Calderón Urreiztieta i faré aquesta moderació d'aquest acte i tot i que podria fer-ho en català, pot adonar-se que el meu accent no és massa català, és més ben dit una mica caribeny. Així que prefereixo fer el switch al castellà o al caribeny, si vols, per també agradecer al CCCB y al Palau por la organización de este evento como instituciones que están buscando vínculos para hacer arte y cultura para la ciudad. Igualmente mencionar que esta actividad pertenece al programa del Hivernacle, es una idea del Palau muy interesante en donde pienso yo que se pretende demostrar que la música no es solo escucharla y juzgarla, también hay que prepararla, hay que comentarla y hay que disfrutarla también. So, Mr. Brendel, Mr. Sennett, I'm very glad to meet you here, ¿no? Yo haré una pequeña introducción ahora en castellano de los personajes. No quiero hacer enumeraciones de Wikipedia, ¿no? Tenemos esta conversa entre Brendel y Sennett. Y si ponemos el foco en Alfred, prefiero mencionar su obra, ¿no? Desde las obras con Vox, la primera integral de Beethoven, hasta esta inmensa colección de discos, ¿no? Ha llovido mucho ahí, hay mucha música ahí, ¿no? Y además de todo eso, una serie de obras en DVD fantásticas, también con cantantes célebres, y esta caja que es un tesoro de las sonatas de Schubert. Pero además de eso, Brendel ha trabajado, ha escrito mucho libros sobre música, también, y muchos de ellos, dos de ellos han sido traducidos al castellano por Acantilado en dos excelentes ediciones sobre la música y el diccionario de la A a la Z, son dos muy buenos libros. Y además, hace poco se ha editado la traducción de este libro de poemas de Alfred Brendel, quien ahora siempre ha sido poeta. Yo quisiera entonces hacer una presentación, una self-presentation of Mr. Brendel with this video.
My career is atypical. I have not been a child prodigy. I'm not Jewish as far as I know. I'm not from Eastern Europe. My parents were not musicians, there was no music in the house. I have a good memory, but not a phenomenal one. I'm not a good sight reader. I'm completely at a loss to explain why I made it.
Well, on the other hand, we have Richard Sennett, urbanist and sociologist. We have another nice self-presentation of him. Él es conocido, por supuesto, por una cantidad de obras en torno a la sociología y el urbanismo, desde libros en cooperación como Familias contra la ciudad también, y obras más recientes, el uso del desorden, y ya en traducción al castellano, Carne y Piedra, La corrosión del carácter, El respeto y La cultura del nuevo capitalismo. Todos son obras que creo que nos ayudan a comprender en dónde estamos parados, sobre todo en una ciudad, ¿no? Y sobre todo la trilogía que se llama El artesano, que el CCCB ha hecho una pequeña edición resumida, también juntos, Together, y el último libro, Construir y Habitar, que afortunadamente la editorial Anagrama está por editar. Estas son las pruebas. Pero también Mr. Sennett escribe ficción, escribe novelas. Esta es una de sus primeras novelas. Esta, Palais Royal, también. Y esta otra que se llama An Evening of Brahms, una tarde de Brahms. Y yo quiero que Mr. Sennett se presente así.
You would like to know something about my background. The most obvious autobiographical fact about me is I never meant to be a sociologist. I had another career as a musician. I had to stop. I had hand injury, and I went from being an artist to being a sociologist. I don't recommend it to anyone.
Okay, it's all. We have the two men here. Los tenemos a ellos dos aquí. ¿Eh? Claro, la pregunta que uno pudiera hacerse, bueno, ¿qué hay en común entre estas dos personas, además de ser ciudadanos londinenses? ¿Y qué común hay con el Palau también? Y por supuesto lo que hay en común es la música. Entonces la idea es hablar un poco sobre la música. Como dijimos, Mr. Sennett es un estudio cello, conducting orchestra too, a little bit. And then yo he hecho una especie de organización general de las ideas a partir de los comentarios que ellos me sugirieron para moderar el acto, y lo hemos organizado como en 4 movimientos. Y el primero es la música as a personal experience. And I want to ask them, what about how one person decides to live as a musician? How is to came from music into sociology by accident? What traces this change leave? How did it happen? What does it mean for both of you, music? What do you think about it?
Can we answer only one of those questions?
I turned down.
Well, I had a rather special relation to music because of where I grew up. I grew up in a very poor part of Chicago, in a housing estate. I don't know how you say that in Catalan. And there weren't many people who studied music. And thanks to a nun in the school where I went, I was given a cello when I was 5. And it was my refuge from this pretty miserable, poor environment. It wasn't a horrible experience. I mean, other little kids are usually what they are, and occasionally would harass me. But basically, it was a way of being somewhere else. And so it was everything to me. It was an escape from this very impoverished scene, and I also loved it, and I wasn't too bad at it. I also am a terrible sight reader. So that's how I began to be so engaged in music. It was something I loved, but also something that was an escape from the circumstances of my childhood. You, I think, was rather different.
How did it go on?
Well, as you know, I had a wonderful teacher in Chicago, a man named Frank Miller, who is an enormous, well, sometimes enormous, sometimes very thin.
Yes, each
chest.
year different.
Each year different. He had crash diets in which all of his students sort of, and he was a great cellist, and thanks to him, I then went to Juilliard, and I studied with not so great cellist, but a wonderful person named Klaus Adam, who was...
Oh, I knew him very well.
Yes.
Yes.
Did you ever play with him? With the Juilliard
No,
quartet?
but he was kind enough to host parties after my early New York concerts at his house.
Oh, really?
Yes.
On 12th Street?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about this later. But anyhow, that was my trajectory, and I started to play, and then I had, as this clip said, I actually had what put an end to my career doing this was not I had something called carpal tunnel syndrome. I had it operated on, And in the 60s, hand surgery was not a very developed profession. And the surgery went wrong. So I woke up from the surgery and I had to make another life.
Still tricky, look at Mariparaya.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But you had you eased into music, didn't you? You eased into it. It was something that gradually came in your life.
Yes, but when you say ease...
No,
it's
eased, I mean gradually into it.
Yes, it's maybe not the right word, because my parents were neither musicians nor intellectuals.
Uh-huh.
There was no music at home. We didn't go to concerts or
Oh, really?
the opera. But I got some piano lessons when I was 6 because my parents had enjoyed the same as part of bourgeois education.
Yeah.
So my mother sat next to me and watched me practice until I took off by myself.
Yeah. Which was when, do you think?
With 10, when
10,
I was
12.
10, 12, yes.
But you wanted to be a painter at one point, I know, at some point.
I wouldn't say that I wanted to be anything. I wanted to be independent rather early on. But immediately after the war, I had a short period of genius. I was doing everything. I was composing, playing the piano, writing sonnets, series of sonnets, painting, drawing,
Well, that's what you're
reading
supposed to do.
enormously.
Yeah.
Until my piano teacher, who was a civilized lady, said to me when I was 16, "I've told you everything that I can tell you. Now look after yourself. You should give a first piano recital and you should play for the great pianist Edwin Fischer, which he arranged."
My God.
The first piano recital was a success, which was important in the face of my skeptical mother. And then things sorted themselves out. But writing stayed in the back of my mind and became later on in my life quite important. Became a second life.
Yeah, or an additional life. Yeah.
Yes.
So you knew what you wanted. By the time you were an adolescent, you pretty much knew.
Also, when you say I knew, I wouldn't quite be happy with that. I felt that there was a talent.
Right.
But I was never impatient, and I was skeptical soon enough, and thought it had to turn out what the talent amounts to and how it will act up in later life. I was thinking of some artists that were in their 50s and that I admired, thinking I would like to reach a similar point when I'm 50, not when I'm 25.
Really?
Which is quite unusual.
That is.
Yes.
That is. You know, but the odd thing I think about music as an art is that because of the technical requirements of it, that there is a kind of delay is not possible. You couldn't have the life you wanted if you'd started at 18. And that's good and bad, I think, because sometimes when we come late to a practice, to an art practice, you have a more kind of adult feeling about what mastery is. You know, adolescence, it was certainly the case with me. When you can do something well at a very young age, you know, it's part of that whole grandiose thing that adolescence is. People who come to poetry or to painting in their 20s have a much less grandiose kind of formation about what they can do with it. At least that's been true in my experience. We're a very unusual art in that way because it's all there at a very, very early age.
Yes, and my particular development was completely unusual. I was used to find out things for myself relatively early because I could not share many of my interests with my parents. They loved me, they were punctual, they had good teeth, which
very important, very important.
Which I have inherited, and I'm grateful for that. But on the other hand, I had to be relatively soon on my own in matters of the mind.
I had a very different experience because, and this is something about the culture of the arts in America in the 50s and 60s. It was very much shaped by refugees, and it was really very communal, and people talked a lot. Murray and I, for instance, read books together, discussed them all the time. It was also quite political, not for us, but for a lot of other artists because of Vietnam War and so on. So I had a very communal experience of very different from yours, and I think it was also that these were kids. We were kids on our own. There were no parents. You know.
Yes. Yes.
We'd left them.
Well, we had a very different set of experiences in the younger age. I lived between my 6th and my 14th year under fascists and Nazis, which has very importantly formed my mind.
How so?
That was a kind of communal existence that I hated.
Right.
With the result that I wanted to be as little communal as possible, and as independent as possible. I wanted to feel space around me. I never masterminded a festival, or I didn't invent a party. I mistrusted clans of all kinds.
It's amazing we've become friends because.
Mr. Sennett, I would like to say something. You have in your book, in this book, An Evening of Brahms, some paragraph when you say that Alexander, the main character, is a young, taking your words, adolescence, communal, and Gerda, his mother, doesn't want that he studied piano, because piano is a social instrument, and he wants to study cello, because violoncello is an integrative, collective instrument. You are a pianist. You are a social, not. I hope not. We are talking about communal. And I would like to pass to other level when we talk about this group, this idea of group experience, music as group experience. And then music as a model of good relations, music, as Adorno said, you said me, chamber music, the most civilized way of cooperating, listening to each other in piano or in cello, no? I hope. And I would like to put to the people a piece of music, the piano quartet in C minor of Brahms, that you describe in this book very, very neatly, no? Very clearly. Then, and so we hear some music.
By the way, before you play it, I want to say that I mistrust pianists who are completely asocial. That means that are only soloists. They think, I'm alone, nobody can disturb me while I play. I can play my feelings spontaneously. Look at these poor fools who have to play together. This is completely alien to me.
Well, let's hear the piano quartet, the very beginning, the exposition of the theme. I have subtitled the video with the text of Mr. Sennett. I hope it aids to talk about group experience. improvisation. It's amazing to look at Veronica Hagen, the violist, looking each other. Is it true? Is chamber music a model of good relations? What is listening to each other? Is a model of living together?
Symbol of democracy. To listen to each other, to converse with each other. During the rehearsals, to fight in a polite way.
Well, I tell you, when I think about that model now, what I think about is something a little different than this, which is that when musicians rehearse, they don't necessarily explain that there are lots of ways of rehearsing that are nonverbal and only physical. And what interested me about this now, at this point in my life, not when I wrote this novel, which is not a very good novel. Your first novel is always a confession, it's terrible. But what interests me at this point about this is that what are the ways in which people can communicate with each other which are not necessarily explicit, saying what you should do, what should happen here, and so on. But as we know from rehearsing, sometimes just raising an eyebrow is a way of having a conversation with somebody else. And for me, when I think now about this as a model, as a rehearsal, this is a famous quote of Adorno. I can't remember where he said it. Adorno?
Well, he said something like, this is the most civilized way of people communicating.
Yeah. But for me, when I think about what it means now, it's that what's civilized about it is that it's indirect, that it's about context rather than aggressive kind of, we should do it this way. That kind of communication, that's civilized.
Well, you mean, there are insider books on quartets. One of the best is by the present first violin of the Takacs Quartet, who is English. A beautiful literary piece of work. Another one is by the leading agent of quartets, Sonja Simenauer, in Germany. It turns out that there are sometimes bloody fights.
Sure, of course.
And it is sometimes very hard for people to endure in the long run.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
So it is not always smooth and indirect. Yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is that what makes it civilized is not that people have understood each other in a way that can be articulated. They just do it together. And that the body comes in as a way, body language comes in as a way of communicating. That's what's been on, we've both had rehearsals where things were anything but civilized. But what I'm saying is that what comes to me is now when I think about why rehearsals and chamber music, particularly playing it, is a kind of model of civility, is that it has this quality of not having to define everything, to make everything explicit. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, but also to reconcile different ideas.
Right.
Somebody has an idea, the viola has a different idea, the cello has a third idea. Now they have to choose.
Or not. Or not.
Of course, they try out.
Yeah.
Maybe they try out more than once.
Yeah.
Then they have to decide for something.
Yeah. Yeah. But
By the way, I wanted to say that besides chamber music units like a quartet, there are big organizations which pursue the idea of collaboration in musically and humanly, like Marlboro in America, and now like Krzyżowa in Poland since 3 years.
What's it called?
They kind of, this was a place in Silesia, which was called Kreisau. Silesia was a very important part of Germany,
Yeah.
which, when the war was lost for Germany, was given to Poland. All the people were kicked out and were absorbed by Germany. But the Countess Moltke, who was English by birth, still stayed in their little country house. Moltke was an important German family of generals in the 19th century and 20th century, but also of resistance to Hitler. And the last Moltke was killed by Hitler before the end of the war. And his widow now tried to further reconciliation, also between East and West. Wow. And this is working in a very expressive way, on a very high level.
Yeah. Yes. Well, Marlborough, where I played, was also like there was very sustained working with younger and older musicians. Civilized half. We were tyrannized by many of these older musicians, but that's another story. I just think there is something about what we've lived in musical experience which has an enormous resonance in the everyday world. And this is one of the, much more than, I mean, in my own writing, I've really used what musical experience as kind of model for things like cooperation at work, communal relations, and so on. And I just think, we know more about society than we think we do. Even though we're never, you're not a sociologist, thank God. But I think there's something that is there as a kind of resonance, which I don't feel is there with, say, with painters or something like that, which is really an activity which can be done by yourself.
It depends which musicians you talk about. Yeah. The rivalry between organists, for instance, is huge.
Yeah.
Not to speak about some singers.
Well, singers I put in that's another category.
Oh no, singers for me are very important in music. Yeah. If there was an explanation of why I was playing the piano, it also comprised the fact that I always thought in terms of singing in the orchestra. To turn the piano into a cantabile instrument and to turn it into an orchestra. And that, for me, justified the effort in a way. If the piano remains just the piano, not much is done. So much of piano music has direct connections to the other compositions of the same composer, because nearly all the great piano composers were ensemble composers for chamber music, for orchestra, for the voice. Only Chopin is the solo composer. Yeah.
I would like, Mr. Brendel, that you said society, we are talking about orchestra, big groups. So I would like to pass a next level. Music as a social experience, not group experience, social experience. You told me about, and you have talked recently about how is music from fanaticism and music told from above, to discuss ideas in freedom in music. You know? What is the relation of music with power? What is the relation of music with a free individual in 21st century? And Mr. Sennett talked about what is music and relation with expressive art practice in everyday life. I would like that you explain what does it mean. Yes. What it's everyday life expressive art practice.
Explain to me.
Well, no, first of all, I want to say that an orchestra has to be told from above what to do. There cannot be an orchestra that discusses.
We're going to vote now.
There has been an attempt in the Soviet Union, an orchestra called Persymphons in the 20s, which played without conductor. And there was Orpheus in New York, which did actually pretty well in getting along with each other. Yeah. But generally, if the spirit of the conductor is strong enough, and then it is all right for the orchestra to get messages. If soloists play with each other like in a trio, it's a different matter. But it may be that one of the trio people is a dominant personality, and the others will gladly submit or listen to what he or she has to offer.
So have you ever had the experience of playing with a conductor where you were totally at odds with each other?
Very rarely. My experiences were that conductors were very helpful as long as they saw that the soloist knew the piece really well, also the whole piece, and didn't ask for things that were loony. I mean, that an orchestra couldn't or wouldn't do. But there were a few conductors I refused to play with, not for personal reasons, because I realized that there was not enough that we had musically in common.
Right. I think of there was a famous concert in New York of Glenn Gould and Leonard Bernstein, where Bernstein came out on at the beginning of the concert and said, "It's really impossible. We can't agree on anything about it." Was it Brahms second or Brahms
No, Beethoven 4.
The D minor.
The D minor.
Yes.
Yeah. It actually sounded pretty good, but that's another story.
No, but this was a recording that you heard.
I did.
And in fact, it was much too soft to start with what Glenn Gould played.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Well, Glenn Gould was the great eccentric among pianists, and revered for that matter. Zubin Mehta told me he was on a tour with the Brahms D minor concerto in Canada with Glenn Gould, and he saw that Glenn Gould, during the first tutti, was sitting there conducting. And then Zubin conducted his Seitenthema, his second part.
And did Gould take it? Yes.
Oh, he had to. Maybe he found it amusing. Yes.
So what else do you want to ask us?
I wanted that.
What else do you
No,
want to
I
know?
want that you talk us about this idea of art not transcendental, art
Oh,
in
I see.
everyday life. Can we be an artist in everyday life with no this transcendental idea of art, genius? No, is this possible?
I see. Well, who knows? But what I would say to you about a couple of things about this. One, that from my own experience as a child, when I see something like the il sistema, the Abreu way of engaging just ordinary kids in the making of really of art, that this is something to me, you know what this system is, that very poor children are plunged at an early age into a very disciplined way of practicing and performing. Alfred told me that he heard a performance by somebody in Mahler at the age of 10.
In Salzburg there was a whole week of Sistema, and the youngest orchestra were players from 8 to 12.
Unbelievable.
And they performed the first Mahler symphony. It was one of my greatest impressions that I had in Salzburg for 40 years.
Amazing.
Simon Rattle wonderfully rehearsed them.
Yeah, he's great.
And they were so devoted in playing. There's a film where you can see everything.
Yeah.
So Sistema is a unique interaction of music and sociology. It's not been there before.
And I mean, the thing that from the social side about it is important is that very poor communities are people's everyday lives are very disorganized. You're making do from day to day, a missed amount of money for a week and a family doesn't eat. That's very disorganizing. And from a social point of view, the notion that a little kid has got to practice every day for 4 hours, or it's 2 to begin, and then it goes up, is a kind of great gift, that you're making a gift of kind of order in people's lives. When Abreu first had this idea, of course the snobby reaction was, poor kids can't do this. This is high art, and how can you have poor children playing this way? And that's just wrong. And I think it's resonant in the notion that I've never believed in the distinction between high art and low art in terms of audiences. I think even with playing, difficult modern music, people are there for it. And I loathe the word accessible. I don't know if that's a kind of buzzword in thinking about art for the public here. But in Britain, the notion is you don't want to scare ordinary people, but you want to make everything accessible to them. That's an incredibly condescending way of thinking about the relation of public to great art. And this Sistema is a kind of, Mahler first is not an easy piece of music to play. It's accessible. And I feel with a lot of arts policy that it's so condescending to people. They want to hear you. They don't want to hear stuff that they hear in the street. They should hear you. And there's a kind of, I don't know what it is, kind of liberal, well-meaning, make the art yourself and so on. This is wrong. This is a very wrong way to think about the way publics relate to artists. So those are the kinds of thoughts I've had about this. And I guess I feel very strongly about this because Britain, and to some extent the US, but particularly Britain, has in its arts policies a kind of nanny, I don't know how you translate this, nanny state idea that you will make everything easy for people, that you won't challenge them, that you won't say, this is a really hard piece of music, this is difficult, learn it, get into it. Everything is this kind of middle class, de haut en bas, looking down, saying, we're not going to feed you anything that isn't accessible. So anyhow, I'm sorry about this rant, but...
I only want to clarify, as Venezuelan citizen, that Sistema is a great idea, but now it's very politicized.
In Venezuela.
In Venezuela. It's a complex problem. Abreu was a great man who has the aid of all the governments. Now it's very politics. Dudamel cannot go to Venezuela.
Well, many musicians have left.
Has left. No?
Some were even killed.
Yes. Well, let's talk now about music only.
I just want to follow up what you said before, very briefly. As a pianist, I always had the impression that the pianist should not play down to the public. The public has to listen up to the artist. Yeah. I have the same impression with newspapers. The newspapers should not write for the lowest common denominator, as many do these days. You should write on a level that encourages the readers to strive to understand what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, that's capitalism in a way, which we're not going to talk about. We're also not going to talk about Brexit. But, I was very struck. I have to say, I went to a concert of yours where you played the Liszt Sonata, which was not often played in New York. This is a long, long time ago when we first knew each other. And I went to this concert where a long time ago, where you played the Liszt Sonata. Yes, yes. It was difficult for people, but you brought them up to it, and it's...
Oh, but in meanwhile, it's a party piece.
It's a party piece,
yes.
No. Well, of a certain kind of party.
Meanwhile, strange things have happened. The Diabelli variations have become a party piece. Nearly every pianist is now playing them. 20, 30 years ago, it was a rarity to find them in a program.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
There are always endurance tests that are taken up by particularly younger pianists to show that they can master something. I mean, play the right notes.
When you began as a pianist, was there such an emphasis on a pervasive emphasis on kind of technical perfection? Did you feel that if
not yet, because it was the influence of the recording music that has changed the perception of listening. In the past, there were some great performers who were not always completely clean.
Yeah. Well, that was true.
Now one expects from an artist on stage that one can record him or her live without any blame. Which it has some good things and bad things.
Yeah.
Now that you're talking about playing piano, I would like to pass to the fourth movement, and we will listen to Alfred Brendel playing a piano piece. Music as a discipline, music and its relation with other disciplines, how music could shape writing or poetry is a good question for Mr. Sennett. Music, art, literature, what do they mean to a sociologist? Brendel asked to Sennett. And I give the counterpoint, society, urbanism, the city, what do they mean to a musician, to a poet?
What are we doing first?
These are quotes for the males. No? But begin to talk of this. I would like to hear, I have all my life waiting for this moment to hear Brendel in front of Brendel. We would like to hear Andantino, the Schubert Sonata in A major, D959. It's a wonderful movement. It has two parts. In the center, as Mr. Brendel has said, there is a rage, an anarchy, a chaos, like Goya drawings, you have said. Let's listen this, and then we talk.
You will see that at that stage I was half as old as I am now.
Can we talk after this?
I haven't heard it in ages, this performance. Yeah.
Very good. How music, Richard, shapes writing or poetry? Do you think musically when you write the phrases, the poetry, the fiction, the non-fiction?
To a degree. I hear the sound of what I write. I mean, the sound of the words and the sentences and the rhythm.
The rhythm.
Even if my poems are not prosodic, there is rhythm. It is like in contemporary music, the fact that the rhythms constantly vary. Instead of remaining the same for 4 and 8 bar periods.
And Richard, you?
Otherwise, it's a very different matter. Yeah. It has nothing very little to do with my playing of great music.
You don't, in other words, you don't hear a poem matched to, it's not like Murray, Pariah.
Absolutely not, no.
Who hears a poem with a piece of music. Not at all.
No, I can, to a degree, understand that the second movement of Beethoven's G major piano concerto was associated with the Orpheus myth.
Right.
Already at a relatively early stage. I can see that. But this is an exception.
Yeah. Well, I have a much simpler version of that, which is what I know that I've taken into writing from music is phrasing. And the only trace I have a much more schizophrenic in a way is just that I hear, well, maybe it's the same for you, I hear the length of sentences in terms of breathing and phrase making as I heard it in music. But I don't know, for me it's quite the actual work of making, because what I do is very prosaic, it's not another art, although I try and write well. But so it's a simpler thing. But I'm curious about that. So it's really sort of modern music, which would be more the way its tempi lie and its or conflict with each other is something that got into your making of poetry. Is that it? That it's not regularity that you're looking for, but something else.
Yes. If I think of my poems, which came completely by surprise.
Really? What do you mean?
I think of a different persona in myself. It's obvious that they come from me, but I sometimes think, where do they come from? And this is one of the nice things about it.
So in other words, schizophrenia is probably, for both of us,
maybe not as grave as that, yes. But I think it's very valuable to have more than one personality, or several brands of whatever one is.
Tell me, one thing I always wanted to ask you is, when you hear, that's an earlier self of yours, when you hear things that you've made, in an earlier life, now, do you have the feeling that you want to revise them, you want to do them again? What I'm thinking about is that for writing, once it's printed, that's pretty much it. Only, you're not going to remake every sentence again.
Well, if you have good relations to the publisher, you can still change it.
Never.
I had a new volume out in May, and later on I found 7 mistakes.
Oh, well, that's
partly,
something else.
partly friends talking to me and then listening. This editor was not particularly good, and I will insist that.
I'm asking something else, which is that piece of writing is relatively finished when it's printed. A performance never is.
You are right in principle, but when I think of Alfred Corot's performances of the Chopin's 24 Preludes, there are 4 recordings. There are differences, but the concept is the same. But it's a concept that appears to be improvised, and has, for a long time, has not lost its immediacy.
Yeah. But I'm asking for you. I mean, do you, when you hear something like this, do you think that was another musician? When you hear something, an old piece like this, I mean, there's something about performance which is much more fluid, which is redoable, which is in time in a different way than
Yes, of course.
Is. That's what I'm talking
Yes, of course.
about.
But then there are types who are basically improvisers and go on stage and I want to be surprised today. I want to surprise myself. I want to play differently than last time. There are such people. And sometimes do the craziest things. Yeah. There should be confines within which one has a certain amount of freedom. But to find the confines is one of the tasks of a performer.
Right. It's something I really missed about when I stopped playing music, that you could do it again. You know, you can't write the same, well, maybe your publisher, your long-suffering publisher thinks you're doing that, but it's something I really missed when I started writing, that it's relatively fixed and that you have to leave it, you have to surrender it. And I'm not sure that that's a word that for musicians really means the same thing. I've never been able to read one of my books again because it's over.
No, I'm laughing because you showed me the volume of my translated poems, and I looked up a poem that I like, and my hair stood on end when I saw that there were 2 lines at the end which I eliminated, which were in a first version of a. Well, but I mean, I don't know how many people will enjoy hearing a German text. I shall try to make it as fascinating as possible.
Philanthropist.
Und wiederum hatte der Herr der Heerscharen einen menschenfreundlichen Tag zu verzeichnen. 3 Religionskriege vom Zaun gebrochen, etliche Wirbelstürme entbunden, eine neue Seuche kreiert, Utopien in die Seelen gepflanzt, ungezählte Kinder erfolgreich zu Schaden gebracht. Da konnte man sich als Fürst der Welt eine Sekunde Ruhe gönnen, etwas Lyrisches tun, den Blick dieses Mannes auf jene Frau lenken, hinter ihren Brüsten das Herz sichtbar machen, im Herzschlag Angst und Verlangen mobilisieren, ein kleines Höllenfeuer schüren.
It was translated? The translator?
No.
The translator translate this, the poem? Bueno, I will read. Lo leeré en castellano. El filántropo. Y de nuevo, el señor de la Legión de Señores podía contar con un día humano, 3 guerras de religión irrefrenables, numerosos ciclones desatados, una nueva epidemia creada, utopías plantadas en las almas, numerosos niños sumidos con éxito en la desgracia. Así, como príncipe del mundo, se podía uno permitir un segundo de tranquilidad, hacer algo lírico, guiar la mirada de aquel hombre hacia aquella mujer, hacer visible su corazón detrás de su pecho, movilizar miedo y deseo en el latido, atizar un pequeño fuego infernal. How does it sound? Well, these 2 questions are very hard, and we have talked about them. We have to go on.
Yes.
Yes,
As
we have the coda.
As for the first question, what do music, the arts and literature mean to a sociologist? I have a certain reason to ask.
I'm
Because-
I'm worried about
Because I read a famous book by the biologist and historian Harari, called Sapiens.
Yes.
It's worth reading.
Okay.
But at the end of the book, he sums up things and says, actually, Homo sapiens doesn't have delivered great results. He didn't mention the arts in the book at all. This may be typical for some natural scientists. I wrote him,
Oh, you did?
yes.
And?
No, we had a little
he
exchange
wrote.
of letters. But of course, a whole dimension is missing in the book.
Yeah.
At least for me. Yes.
Yeah. So your question to me is, does it mean anything more to a sociologist?
Yeah,
Is that the question you're asking?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm not a sociologist. I have
You've
never
been
been
so
in the
lucky.
company of a society of sociologists or anything. I don't know these people apart from you.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer for sociologists. I don't know many myself, but I give you a sort of serious answer to this, that for a long time, when sociologists looked at art practices, they looked at it as all symbolic of economy, other anthropological beliefs, religious beliefs, and so on. And there was, up until really about 50 years ago, they didn't engage with what artists actually do, which is make expressive work. Mm-hmm. And that began to change thanks to the pragmatist movement, which is a philosophical movement rather than a sociological one, but it had the same thing. And then there were people who began saying, we're just looking at this as labor, and it's not labor, it's an attempt to express something, and we have to understand it. And at that point, the sociology of art divided. There were still people who treated it as a kind of symptom, and then there were people like me who treated society as a symptom of art. But that's it. I mean, I would say that sociologists of art were pretty tone deaf. You know, what actually was being expressed, something that didn't interest them too much. It's what it symbolized, and that's a bad way.
Well, at best, I mean, some of the scientists see in the arts a kind of luxury, and not a necessity.
That would be very. Then how would you explain Lascaux or you know? It doesn't. I think that's a kind of reductionism we don't need to waste our time on. I mean, when I wrote this book, a book on craftsmanship, and one of the things that struck me in writing this book was that even craftsmen of utilitarian things like pots or wheels even, were always decorating them. It's something that from the very first artifacts we have of civilization, they're not just neutral objects. We should probably stop. We could go on for quite a while, but it's and I need a drink.
So we have the coda. It's very short. It's about the future.
Who knows?
I went to your website, and here is a word, the future, here down, the future, here. Mr. Brendel said, traduzco yo, después del concierto final con la Filarmónica de Viena en diciembre de 2008, el cual fue guardado, preservado en una grabación DECA, Mr. Brendel se ha mantenido activo, dando conferencias, escribiendo, haciendo lectura de sus poemas, haciendo masterclass. Ese es el futuro, Mr. Brendel. El futuro lo hemos tenido aquí en escena. Thank you, Mr. Brendel. Now, wait. And now, in the website of Mr. Sennett, there are something very interesting. Dice, Mr. Sennett espera que su último libro, Construir y Habitar, de la trilogía basada en trabajo etnográfico alrededor de 4 comunidades londinenses, genere algunas ideas valiosas de cómo las ciudades pueden ser mejor organizadas o construidas. En caso de que se compruebe que las respuestas son elusivas, escurridizas, ¿no? Él se siente conforme con esa ambigüedad. Y dice Mr. Sennett, a veces queremos tener una imagen del todo, ¿no? ¿Qué se debe hacer? ¿Qué está equivocado? ¿Cómo ir adelante? Y and so on. Pero no podemos tenerla, dice. Todo acto de escritura es incompleto y debe ser incompleto, como seguramente esta entrevista, este diálogo lo ha sido. Nada está establecido para siempre, como esta entrevista.
Well, I'm still
Thanks.
going on working on the pieces that I played in my mind.
That's the question I was asking you. Of course you are. Of course you are.